Okay, let's get proceedings going, and we'll have our opening comments, particularly on the developing of leadership and quality in teaching. Please give a warm welcome to the Chief Executive of the Education Development Trust, Patrick Brazier.
Good morning, everybody, distinguished ministers and all our distinguished delegates. It's a great pleasure to be here in Zimbabwe this morning. What I would like to do is just to frame some of the discussion that we're going to be having today and indeed pick up on some of the comments that our Permanent Secretary made around change. And I want to give you a couple of examples of genuinely successful change and some of the messages around that, particularly for leaders of education systems and for policymakers. So I'm here as the Chief Executive of the Education Development Trust. We are a not-for-profit organisation with an exclusive focus on education. We work with governments and schools worldwide to design and deliver change programs, but one of the important things that we also do is research on what works in education. What we look for is examples of bright spots. We look around the world and see where there has been some success in education, and we try and understand the reasons behind that success and then analyse the lessons that can be learnt by policymakers around the world so that they can adapt those lessons and make sure that they're appropriate for their own particular circumstances. And what I'm going to show you is some examples of some genuine bright spots of change that we have researched over the last year or so. So this is a chart that shows the results from the Programme for International Student Assessment, the PISA tests for science from 2015. And if you look along the bottom axis there, it shows you the GDP per capita of the countries that took part. And if you look along the left axis, it shows you the percentage of achieving level 2 or above. And you can notice we've highlighted one particular score in the top left of this chart. And this is a test taken by about 70 countries in 2015, including mainly members of the OECD, but wealthy countries like France and Germany and the UK and the United States. But interestingly, the best performer of all those 70 countries had the lowest GDP of those countries taking part. And that country was Vietnam. And therefore, we did some research. We went to Vietnam. We interviewed several hundred people in a range of districts across Vietnam, and we wanted to understand how they had achieved this remarkable success obviously with limited resources. And it's actually not just in the science measure in PISA. There's an Oxford University study called Young Lives, which assessed grade 5 students across the world. And in maths, they were able to identify truly exceptional performance in Vietnam. Around 19 out of every 20 10-year-olds can add 4-digit numbers. 85% can subtract fractions, and 81% are able to find x in a simple equation. So there's a genuine level of success in maths and science in the education system in Vietnam. And through our research, we identified 5 areas of promising practice. These are consistent and persistent policy, a strong model of accountability within the education system there, a genuine focus on the quality of teaching, a really important focus by head teachers on instructional leadership within their schools, and a critical role for parents and the wider community in overseeing and engaging and supporting the success of schools in their system. So just to outline some of those consistent and persistent policy priorities, which was sustained, in fact, through our analysis, a 20-year period with consistent application of policy through the government of Vietnam. These included investment in public kindergartens, really engaging in teacher methods, teacher methodologies, supporting teachers with good practice to enable them to teach effectively in all their lessons. Linked to that, improving the pre-service training requirements for teachers at all levels of the school system, and a really strong focus on closing the gap. Ethnic minorities in Vietnam traditionally had performed very poorly in their school systems, and there was a real policy focus on making sure that the gap between the majority and those minority groups was identified and supported and closed through the education system in Vietnam. They also produced a highly effective middle tier within their policy systems, their policy structure, the educational structure, really making sure that there was a link between the top-down policy delivery from government, but absolutely recognizing that you needed a bottom-up engagement in the policy as well. You needed to really rely on the feedback that you were getting from, particularly from regional officials and particularly from head teachers, so that the policy could be developed and adapted to make sure it actually worked in practice, in the classrooms, in the schools across the country. So real support from district and provincial authorities, recognizing that the MOE actually had to receive that feedback and deal with it if it was appropriate to do so. Really identifying school principals as the key interface between the school community and that middle tier, and making sure that there are really strong systems in place for external scrutiny as well as internal scrutiny of the work of the teaching professionals. An interesting and potentially quite challenging policy that the government of Vietnam introduced was to make sure that parents all play an active part in school governance and the daily life of the school. So government regulations insist on that parent partnership, and there is a parent board in every single class. And it's not just the parents, that means that the local community, through the parents, are actively involved in the oversight and support of the education system within individual classes. And this also adds a very significant stake from the community into the quality of the education from their children, but also introduces that level of accountability from the community to make sure, for example, that the teachers are turning up every day, that they are delivering the lessons, that there is a strong focus on the learning outcomes for their children in that system, and that very strong encouragement of two-way communications. One of the things that we did in our study was to ask head teachers, tell us what your typical day comprises. And I think what we want to highlight here is that for a typical head teacher, 3 times every day they were spending time actually in classrooms observing teaching and supporting their teachers to make sure that they were delivering effective quality teaching within the classroom. So 3 times every day the average head teacher would make time to spend time actually in the classrooms with the children, with the teachers, observing what was happening and making sure that their teachers were being supported and being held to account for the quality of their teaching and learning. And that is a typical that illustrates a really positive element of that system. I now want to tell you a completely different story, and then at the end I'll try and draw some conclusions between them. This is from a completely different part of the world, from England. And this particular chart shows the proportion of pupils achieving 5 or more GCEs, that's the age 16 examination in the English school system, in 2001 against the 10 districts where they're measured. And as you can see, in 2001, inner London, less than 40% of the children in those classrooms achieved that effective minimal standard at the end of their year 16, or at age 16 in the education system. Now, inner London is characterised essentially by relatively poor schools, disadvantaged backgrounds, the more challenging areas of the education system. And you could say, well, that's why they performed worst. But if we look at the chart in 2013, inner London schools, with the exception of outer London, were performing the best in the whole system. So within 10 years, those disadvantaged, under-resourced schools had gone from the worst performing in the country to the best performing. So again, how did they do that? Oh, and this is, another measure of their, again in 2017, the latest analysis of Ofsted judgments, London schools, the percentage of schools having outstanding leadership, London outperformed the rest of the UK consistently in that measure. So, how did those London schools improve so dramatically? And again, there's some commonality here. Consistent and persistent policy, instructional leadership, making sure that parents were involved in the education of their children, but also 2 particular examples in London, a really good and effective and systematic use of data, really understanding, often down to the individual pupil level, how children were doing, how schools were performing, how individual teachers were performing, and using that data to model and improve the outcome of those children in those schools. And also, new networks for professional learning, really making schools work together, school-to-school collaboration, good head teachers in some schools supporting weaker head teachers in other schools, good maths teachers in some schools supporting weaker maths teachers in other schools, and really building that network for professional learning across the school community. The consistent and persistent policy priorities were sustained over many years and indeed over 3 changes of government. Some of these policies were introduced by the Labour government back in the early 2000s. They were sustained by the coalition government that came into power in 2010, and then they were continued again by the current government in the UK. And despite the parties changing, there was a consistent focus on this policy because they were able to see the successful results of it. So a London Challenge programme, a real focus on this crisis of London schools and their performance measures, and really making sure that there was a policy focus on the London schools to make a difference. A change of the system, a structural change of the system, introducing academies, taking away the control of some of the schools from the local authority, giving them to organisations who were committed to making a difference in those London schools. New providers brought in to take management control of previously failing schools. And the introduction of the Teach First programme, getting the brightest graduates from the best universities in England to train as teachers and then post them, send them to the most difficult and demanding schools, and using that to really raise the status of the teaching profession in London as a career of choice and something that should be looked up to. So those 3 areas of policy were consistently maintained by successive governments over more than 10 years. And also continuous improvement. As we were interviewing our expert witnesses on the success of London, it really was about building capacity in the system. It wasn't around a one-off change program that had an end. It was about consistently building and sustaining capacity. So, from the story of London to the story of Hanoi and the wider Vietnam, one of the key messages coming out is the power of leadership. And we've come to 4 main conclusions that we believe policymakers around the world, and particularly here in Africa, can really learn from. Policymaking should be consistent and persistent about implementation. You shouldn't chop and change your policy every 2 or 3 years. You need to see it through. You need to build that coalition for sustainable long-term change. Education professionals benefit from both accountability and support. It's really important that education professionals are held to account within the system for the quality of the work that they're delivering. But simply providing an inspection system that marks them and then goes away is not enough. You have to match that accountability with support in terms of in-service teacher education, really good pre-service teacher education, and ongoing commitment to learning communities across schools. The very best school principals are instructional leaders. They see that their job is not an administrative job in order to run a school. They see their role as being critical in working with the teachers in their systems to improve the teaching practice and to improve the learning outcomes. As I said, 1/3 of the day of Vietnamese head teachers is spent actually in the classroom with the teachers supporting better learning. And parental partnership enhances the chances of improved learning outcomes. So really involving parents, really involving the community, using them to support the schools and hold schools to account is a very important part of a successful long-term change in a system. Now, if you want to learn more about either of these case studies, please do look at our research. We've published this research. It's available for free. We've got some examples here. It's available on our website. So Sustaining Success, High-Performing Government Schools in London, and Promising Practice, Government Schools in Vietnam, is available for everybody who's interested in that. And then just to conclude, and in a sense set some of the tone for the debate as we go through the next couple of days. Firstly, really important message, resources are not a barrier to success. Vietnam was the poorest of all the countries that took part in the PISA test, had the lowest GDP per head, but performed best. So resources are not a challenge to successful, sustainable, effective education systems. And change is possible. London schools went from the very worst in the country to the second best in the country over a 10-year period. So commitment to change, seeing through change by policymakers actually does deliver success. And in all of that, leadership is absolutely critical. So leadership from policymakers, leadership from ministries of education, leadership from the middle tier in the education systems, and leadership within individual schools is absolutely critical to make success stick and work. So thank you very much.